I, Dr. Niradhar De, faculty member, School of Education, Indira Gandhi National Open University, welcome you all to this video lesson. Today we are going to discuss one of the very pertinent topic issue on your online course, that is assessment for learning. Today's title is assessment of learning, that is AOL, and assessment for learning, AFL. So, today we will try to understand that what is the concept of assessment of learning and assessment for learning. I have already discussed in my earlier video lesson in module 1 about concept of assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. And today we will discuss detail about this concept and how these two concepts are different with each other. Let us go forward. So, friends, as you know that presently we are in the second week of your online course, that is assessment for learning, and in the second week we are dealing now the second module, that is module 2. The title of this module is Perspectives of Assessment, and you will find two video lessons so far as the content and you can say the teaching learning activities are concerned. In this module, two video lessons are included. First is Perspectives of Assessment, that is in the context of behavioristic perspective of assessment, cognitivist perspective of assessment, and constructivist perspective of assessment. Already you have gone through these video lessons, and already you have acquainted, I am sure that you might have acquainted with all these concepts, that is the context and perspectives of assessment as per the behavioristic approach, as per the cognitivist approach, and as per the constructivist approach. And the second video lesson today that we are going to discuss, that is assessment of learning AOL and assessment for learning AFL. So, these two video lessons are there, and today we are discussing the second video lesson of this module. And friends, the learning outcomes of this video lesson is, after going through the detailed content related to this video lesson and the video lesson, you will be able to explain the concept of assessment of learning AOL, then you will be able to explain the concept of assessment for learning, that is AFL, and you will be able to discuss the shift from assessment of learning to assessment for learning. So, what is the shifting from AOL to AFL? Okay. So, keeping in consideration of the concept of its practices, especially in the classroom situations. So, we will try to understand that what are the different shifting from a traditional approach to a new approach, from a behavioristic approach of assessment to a constructivist you can say approach of assessment. And further, after going through these video lessons and related content point of this module, you will be able to differentiate between assessment of learning and assessment for learning. Okay. Then after differentiating these two concepts and its practices, then you will also able to use these concepts in your teaching behavior, in the teaching learning process, mostly assessment for learning, because this has been developed as per the constructivist approach of teaching and learning process. So, friends, now let us go forward to understand detail about these two concepts. First of all, in my earlier video lesson, I have already discussed that the categories of assessment. So, there are three categories of assessment. First is assessment of learning, second is assessment for learning, and the third is assessment as learning. Assessment of learning, which is based upon the behavioristic approach of teaching and learning as well as assessment, and assessment for learning, which is based upon the cognitivist approach of teaching and learning and assessment. And assessment as learning, it is also some extent related with the constructivist approach of teaching and learning. So, when the learners independently doing certain work, and when the learners are doing self study and they are getting feedback by self observation, you can say, means when the learners are involved in different you can say self study, and the learner is able to find out the strengths and weaknesses of the learners himself or herself, then further they can improve keeping in consideration the strengths as well as the weaknesses. So, that is called as the assessment as learning. So, here also learning happens by self assessment, by involving the individual themselves. They also do assessment for their for their you can say educational attainment. And further assessment of learning, which is a traditional approach of assessment. I have already said in my earlier video lesson that here the assessment is mostly focused upon a summative types of assessment, that is a product oriented assessment, you can say, but assessment for learning is a process oriented assessment. That means how learning takes place, and how assessment not only provide data or provide information about the performance and achievement of the learners, rather it also descriptively provide you can say detailed data about how learning takes place among the learners. So, that is why it is also called this is also called as assessment for learning. That means assessment here enhance learning for the learners. So, these three concepts, basing upon these three concepts, you will find that today we will discuss the detail about that, what are the other discourses and other you can say concept that is included with these three elements of assessment. So, first now let us focus upon assessment of learning. So, now we will discuss about the concept of assessment of learning. As I have already said that assessment of learning that focuses from behavioristic perspective of assessment. That means here assessment is not a continuous process, rather you can say assessment is a term end process. That means after completion of a term, after completion of an academic session, or after completion of a semester, what assessment is conducted to know the performance level, or to know the achievement of the learners, or to grade the learner, or to certify the learners, the assessment that we do. So, that is based upon the behavioristic perspective, and that we can say that that is assessment of learning. That means we are just going to assess the quantum of learning, the quantum of learning that the learners have achieved, that the learners have attained. And for the assessment of learning, it also assesses the extent of learning that has been taken place in a particular time. So, that means here you see a particular time means you can say it may be in a term, it may be in a semester, or it may be in a year. So, here within the year, within the semester, what is the extent of learning, what is the quantum of learning. Okay. So, whether the learners have achieved most of the instructional objectives or not, whether the learners have achieved the minimum level of learning in a particular subject or not. So, that we do from this concept, from these practices of assessment of learning AOL. And further we can say it measures the quantity of learning in terms of marks or grades. I have already said that here quantity is given importance, quality is not given much importance here so far as assessment of learning, because this is a pen and paper types of test, and this test we conduct is a summative types of test, and that we conduct after completion of the terms, after completion of the semester, after completion of the entire academic year, you can say. And after conducting a test or the summative test under this assessment of learning, we assign certain marks, certain grades, certain percentage to the learners, and we also you can say certify them whether they are pass or fail, or in different grades also we certify them. And further we can say assessment of learning presents one's achievement in different criteria like high or low achievement, pass or fail, etc. High and low achievements. So, friends, when we conduct a test, then we evaluate that test, the responses of the learners, and then after we provide a mark or we provide a grade. That grade may be a higher grade or may be a lower grade. The percentage of marks, you can say it may be a 40%, it may be 60%, or it may be 80%. So, through assessment of learning, what we do, we fix certain criteria, and as per the criteria, we present the achievement and performance of the learners, either it is high performance or low performance, high achievement or low achievement, and further pass or fail, whether the learner passed in a particular subject over a particular time period, or whether the learner is fail in a particular subject in a particular time period. So, that also do through assessment of learning. And further we can say that assessment of learning emphasizes achieving minimum level of learning. So, here we have to first understand that what is the minimum level of learning, what are the minimum skills and competencies the learners they are supposed to achieve from a particular content, from a particular unit, from a particular module, from a particular chapter, and whether by conducting certain tests that may be in assessment of learning. So, we will get idea, we will get data about the learners, that whether the minimum level of learning that has been achieved by the learners or not. Let minimum level of learning, let all will achieve or all will reach at a level that is 50%, whether all have reached at 50% or not. And in other words, we can say that minimum level of learning means how much of mathematical skill, how much of language skill, how much of competencies in social sciences and other science subjects the learners they are supposed to achieve, they are supposed to attain in a particular stage or in a particular standard, in a particular level. It may be class 9th, it may be class 10th, it may be in 11th or 12th or in class 8th. So, that you have to first define the minimum level of learning, and accordingly you have to find out that whether the learners are reaching that minimum level of learning or not. So, it comes under the purview of assessment of learning. So, friends, now let us go forward to understand more about assessment of learning. Assessment of learning is periodical and terminal in nature. I have already said that after completion of a period, it may be a quarter, it may be 3 months of time, or it may be 6 months, a semester, or it may be a year also. So, after completion of a period or a term, we conduct assessment of learning. Then further it supports summative evaluation, that is called as that means the evaluation that we conduct after completion of a semester or after completion of a term. Okay. So, that is called as summative evaluation. And friends, let me to say in our next video lesson in module 3, we will discuss detail about summative evaluation and other types of evaluation as per the functions of evaluation. And further to discuss more about the concept of assessment of learning, we can say that it is the end product of learning, means after completion of the teaching learning process, after completion of the semester, then as a teacher we want to know that whether the learners have or how much the learners have achieved. Okay. So, for that we do such type of assessment. So, this is the end product of learning. Then further we can say it happens after completion of the teaching. Then the feedbacks that we receive through assessment of learning, that is feedback received through AOL, hardly helps the learner for further improvement. So, friends, here you see, because the feedbacks or the comments that the learners will get, that is after completion of that period or after completion of that semester. Again that semester will not come back, or again that particular academic session will not come back, because already teaching learning process has completed. So, that is why the feedback that you will get after the semester end examination or the annual examination. So, here hardly the learners will get any scope for further improvement. Okay. So, that is why these are the traditional approach of teaching learning process, traditional approach of assessment in teaching learning process that we are doing earlier. And now further we will discuss about the next concept, that is concept of assessment for learning. which is based upon the constructivist approach of teaching and learning process. Here the learners are given importance, the learners ability, learners need, learners skills and competencies are given importance so far as assessment for learning is concerned. Okay, so here teachers work as a facilitator for the learners, teacher works as a stage setter for the learners, teacher works as a guide for the learners, but most of the learning activities, most of the teaching learning experiences that are shaped, that are designed, that are finalized, keeping in consideration the graduated skills, the skills and competencies which is required from that content, from that subject over a period of time. So that is why here assessment for learning is based upon the constructivist approach of teaching and learning process. So here you can say every learner develop their own learning, they have the ability to construct their own learning. So that is why here when the learners are having their own strength for constructing their own learning, so that is why accordingly we have to design the assessment. Okay. And here assessment helps the learner for enhancing their learning, not only to know the end product, rather it focuses upon the process aspect of the learning, means how learning is taking place, then accordingly the learners will get feedback whenever there is learning, whenever there is teaching, then assessment will be included with it. So here assessment is a inclusive practices in the teaching learning process so far as the constructivist approach is concerned, which is very much based upon the assessment for learning. Then further we can say that it expresses how learners learn. Okay. So how learning takes place, how learners learn. So keeping in consideration of the feedbacks that the learners are getting, so further what they will do, they will try to develop themselves, they will try to modify themselves, they will try to solve the earlier difficulties that they have faced in the teaching learning process. And further we can say that assessment for learning reports learners progress with descriptive indicators, not only in marks and grades. Earlier I was talking about in assessment of learning, it focuses upon grades and marks. That means the quantitative aspect of describing one's achievement, but here you will find in assessment for learning that descriptive indicators are used. So here descriptive indicators means in what aspect the learners are able to do in mathematics, in algebra, in mensuration and other aspect of mathematics. So what are the different aspect the learners are perfectly doing and what are the different aspect the learners are the learners have achieved or learners have developed this skill in 50% of the cases or in 70% of the cases or in 90% of the cases. So here the criterion will be fixed, then the report of the students will be prepared as per the descriptive indicators, means the learners are able to do how many different activities in a subject in academic life in a particular class and what are the different things the learners are not able to do. So it is something different than marks or the grades, rather descriptively you have to explain that what is the strengths and weaknesses of the learners. Then further assessment for learning is a broader term than assessment of learning, it goes one step ahead. Okay. And further assessment for learning is mostly done through formative and diagnostic evaluation. So two types of evaluation are permitted, are conducted under this assessment for learning. One is the formative assessment and other is the diagnostic assessment. Further we will discuss that what is formative assessment, which is based upon the continuous and comprehensive assessment, and diagnostic assessment is also it goes simultaneously with formative assessment. Further we will discuss. Then to understand more about the concept of assessment for learning, we can say that learning needs to be considered as a continuum. So it is conducted through continuous and comprehensive assessment. That means whenever there is a teaching learning process, then definitely some types of assessment will be there. By using varieties of tools and techniques, it may be a test, it may be a questionnaire, it may be a scale, it may be a sociometric technique, it may be a type of interview or observation. You will find that in assessment for learning, for continuous and comprehensive assessment, all aspects of children's development, individuals' developments are assessed, and varieties of tools and techniques are also used. And further, we can say that assessment for learning, it prepares or you can say learners plays a central role in assessment for learning. Means every activities, every assessment practices are designed keeping in consideration of the learners. It is not keeping in consideration the teacher, rather learners are important aspect so far as assessment for learning is concerned. And further, it helps the learner for enhancing their learning by achieving by active participation in learning and activities. Then it helps the learner achieving equity and equality in assessment component of the curriculum. So, here you see, first of all I have talked about enhancing their learning, that the learner, when they will involve themselves in assessment practices, equally they will also enhance their learning. Okay, this is not a term and examination that only you will find out what is the product, what is the grade or the marks. It is the process, it deals the process aspect of learning and assessment. And for the equity and equality, as I have said that the students to whom you are facing in your classroom, they are coming from varieties of background, they are coming from diverse background. So, that is why a single tool, a single technique may not be appropriate for all level of students, for all students in a class. Those are coming from different different areas, different socio-economic background and different diverse backgrounds. So, for them varieties of tools you are supposed to use in teaching learning process, at the same time also in assessment. A test may be suitable for a few group of students, and a test may not suitable for another group of students. Many, you can say, many children you will find in your class, they are from differently able. So, for them different strategies, different technique and different tool that you have to use. You can use a type of observation. By observing the learners when they are doing something within the groups, you can also assess them. Okay. By interacting with them, you can also do. So, varieties of tools and techniques you can use, and a single tool is not appropriate for all the students so far as assessment for learning is concerned. And further, we can say that it addresses diversities and varieties of background of the learners, as its aim is to achieve equity with equality. So, that is why it addresses the diversities. Okay. Keeping in consideration the diverse nature of teaching and learning process, the assessment practices will be designed. And further, teachers act as a facilitator, guide, initiator and motivator. Teacher is not a preacher here, teacher is not only to teach, rather teacher is to facilitate the learners, because the learner is having the ability to construct their own learning. So, that is why teacher will facilitate the learner in their assessment, at the same time in teaching learning process for enhancing learning of the learners. Let us go forward. Then the third concept I have already discussed, and just let me to touch upon this very briefly, touch upon this point, assessment as learning, that is called as AAL. So, when learners personally involved to monitor his or her own learning. As a learner, when you are doing the self study and when you are getting, by self study you are getting many ideas that how you have performed and how better you can perform. Okay. What are the you can say shortcomings that you have done earlier and how to remove those shortcomings. So, that inspiration and that insight you will get from within, because as a learner you are involved in teaching learning process and you are also involved in self assessment. So, self assessment, through self assessment, the learning that you are taking place, that is called as assessment as learning. Then further, feedback through self assessment helps the learner to enhance his or her own learning, and the learner critically evaluates different situations, asks reflective questions for his or her own development. So, have you ever asked question about your performance and why have you not done well in a particular aspect, in a particular component of your learning? So, if you ask questions, then definitely you will get certain motivation, get certain insight that you have to involve yourself again in the teaching learning process, and definitely you will try to improve yourself. So, it comes under assessment as learning. And further, under assessment as learning in AAL, we can say that learner, him or herself, understand his or her previous experiences and achieve new knowledge through self-learning. Friends, now let us try to differentiate, very briefly differentiate between two concept, assessment of learning and assessment for learning. I have already discussed the concept with examples, and here I will just touch upon that how these two concepts are different. First of all, assessment of learning is based upon the behavioristic approach, whereas assessment for learning, which is based upon the constructivist approach, means how learning is constructed, how knowledge is constructed by the learners and how they are involved to know their shortcomings. And further, assessment of learning, it not follow learner centric approach of assessment, but whereas assessment for learning, it follows learner centric approach of learning. Okay, one is teacher centric, that is assessment of learning, and other is as per the assessment for learning. Here you will find that assessment is based upon student centric, learner centric, child centric. And further, assessment of learning, we can say that it is terminal and summative types of assessment, whereas assessment for learning is continuous and formative types of assessment. Okay, one is terminal, I have already discussed, and other is formative, which is continuous. Formative means every day in every class some extent of assessment, some types of assessment, some forms of assessment. It may be a discussion, it may be interaction, it may be observation, it may be a type of interview, it may be a type of pen and paper types of test also. Okay, it may be peer assessment, it may be group assessment, so that will be included with the teaching learning process. And further, so far as the assessment of learning, it uses traditional approach of pen and paper types of test, whereas assessment for learning, it uses varieties of assessment tools and techniques as per the diversity of the learners. I have already said that one is focused upon only a written types of exam based upon pen and paper, whereas the other assessment of for learning, it allows for the use of varieties of tools and techniques. And further, the other differences between AOL and AFL is just like assessment of learning, it measures the product, whereas assessment for learning, it measures the process, how learning takes place and how assessment helps for enhancing learning. And further, assessment of learning, it measures how much or quantity of learning in terms of grades and scores, but assessment for learning, it measures how good and quality of the progress of the learners, means how the learners are involving themselves qualitatively for attaining education, for developing skills, for developing reflective analysis, and they are able to exhibit themselves, they are able to reflect themselves in different aspects. And for the assessment of learning, it focuses a minimum level of learning to achieve minimum level of learning, whereas assessment for learning, it helps learner to achieve minimum level of learning and construct their own learning. So here the learners they are able to construct their own learning after achieving the minimum level of learning. Then further, the feedbacks which is received through assessment of learning, that is a belated feedback, and further that hardly that helps the learner for modifying their learning behavior, whereas assessment for learning, you will find that the feedback, instant feedback they will get, and learners progress happens continuously through this feedback, because assessment is aligned with the teaching learning process. So friends, to recapitulate today's video lesson, we discussed about two important concepts, that is assessment of learning and assessment for learning, and further we also understand that how these two concepts are different from each other. One is based upon the behavioristic and traditional approach of assessment, and other is based upon the constructivist and a modern approach of assessment that helps the learner for enhancing their learning. And for further queries, you can write to me niradhar@ignu.ac.in. You can make me a telephone call. My intercom is 2994, and you can visit my Facebook account, my YouTube channel and Twitter handle. You will find many video lessons relating to education, relating to your studies, relating to your B.Ed program and other areas of education that you will get, and I am sure that that will help you for pursuing your course. Thank you.